Close your eyes and imagine, if you appeared in the medieval age, the landscape stretched out before you in a patchwork of fields, some green, some brown, all dotted with humble cottages. The air smells earthy, sharp, with the scent of hay, dung, and the occasional whiff of bread baking. But the ground beneath your feet, heavy with centuries of tilling, is struggling. Harvests are uncertain, seasons unpredictable, and winters unforgiving. Yet, in the midst of this fragile existence, a few ancient crops have endured. These crops, their resilience in the face of famine and freezing temperatures, were the silent heroes of the Dark Ages. You probably wouldn't survive without them. The cold would be far harsher, and your diet would be even poorer. Now, take a moment before the journey really begins. Go ahead and like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing. Feel free to leave your location and local time in the comments too. Let me know where in the world you're tuning in from. Let's see how far these ancient crops stretched, shall we? Now turn off the lights, switch on a small fan for background noise, and let's begin our nighttime journey. The medieval world was no place for picky eaters. To survive, peasants needed crops that could weather the harshest winters and the driest summers. Among the humble crops, barley stood tall, not just as food, but as the foundation of medieval drink, trade, and bread. This hardy little grain saw peasants through bad harvests, and even worse winters, enduring on the land when other crops would give up. Barley isn't just the grain that fueled medieval ale though. Trust me, it did a lot of that. It was the lifeblood of bread making, and that's no exaggeration. It wasn't just a backup crop or a poor man's wheat. Barley fed entire villages. It thrived in poor, rocky soil, in places where even wheat would struggle to sprout. When the weather got tough, barley stood strong. It could grow in colder regions too, making it perfect for the northern medieval territories, where frost would freeze your crops right into the ground. So next time you drink a pint of ale, remember this hearty grain's contribution to both survival and your Friday night. The sun is low, casting long shadows over the frost-covered fields, and as you make your way across the land, you come upon the next survivor, rye. Rye, like barley, wasn't just another grain. It was the stalwart hero of medieval farming, particularly in the northernmost reaches of Europe. Its hearty nature made it the ideal crop for the cold and unpredictable climate. Rye can handle frost, it can handle poor soil, and it can thrive where other crops, wheat for example, would wither in the face of freezing temperatures. Historians still argue whether rye was truly the most important grain for northern Europe during the medieval period, or whether it was barley. But the truth is, rye was often the go-to crop for regions with long, harsh winters. Imagine the thick rye bread, dense and slightly sour, that kept peasants full through the long winter months. Unlike wheat, which required more ideal conditions to grow, rye had the uncanny ability to withstand freezing temperatures, making it a consistent food source when other grains failed. But rye wasn't just for bread, it could be used for brewing too. You might imagine the locals gathering around their hearths, sipping thick, rich ales made from rye, a drink far heartier than what we're used to today. This hearty, grainy beverage gave medieval peasants the energy they needed to plow their fields or chop wood for the fire. Rye truly was the grain that could survive the winter, both in the ground and in the stomach, and as the cold wind howls and the evening sets in, you can't help but think about how rye continued to fuel life. In medieval Europe, one bread loaf at a time. The evening chill deepens, but you press on, drawn to the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. There, in the distance, you see another essential crop of the medieval world, oats. Oats were the ultimate sustenance grain for medieval peasants, offering versatility in the kitchen and the fields. Unlike barley and rye, oats weren't just for bread and ales, they were essential for porridge, a hearty meal that could stick with you through the coldest of days. In the medieval period, oats were not just seen as animal feed, though they often were for livestock. They played a vital role in the diet of peasants, especially in colder regions. Oats were grown in fields that were often too wet or poorly drained for other crops, but they thrived in these conditions. The resilience of oats was unparalleled. You might even imagine a medieval farmer trudging through mud to harvest a good crop of oats, knowing full well that the coming winter would be much easier with a solid store of porridge in the pantry. Porridge, or gruel, was a staple in medieval kitchens. Imagine sitting down with a bowl of hot, steaming oats, mixed with water or milk, sweetened with honey or berries when available. It was filling, warming, and could last for hours in your stomach, providing the energy needed for a full day of labor. For peasants, it was the comfort food of its time, simple, humble, but immensely nourishing. Historians still debate whether oats were more commonly used in Northern Europe or elsewhere, but their role in survival during medieval winters is undeniable, with the ability to provide quick energy and lasting fullness. Oats were a crucial crop that helped sustain the hard-working peasants throughout the long, cold months. After all, when you're trudging through snow or working in the fields, nothing beats a bowl of porridge to keep your strength up. The snow crunches beneath your boots as you approach the next crop: wheat, the golden grain that helped shape medieval Europe. Wheat was a bit of a luxury compared to the hardy barley and rye, but it had its place in the peasant's diet, and in the fields, wheat's importance in medieval Europe can't be overstated. Even though it wasn't as ubiquitous in every region as barley or rye, wheat was the grain of bread, and bread was a cornerstone of the medieval diet, both for the wealthy and for the common folk. But here's the twist: wheat didn't grow easily everywhere. It required fertile soil and a mild climate, conditions that were often scarce in the colder parts of Europe. So, while wheat was cultivated in more temperate areas, it wasn't always the go-to crop for the average peasant, especially those living in the harshest climates. However, in places where wheat could grow, it was a symbol of prosperity and stability. Imagine walking into a medieval market where loaves of golden, freshly baked wheat bread were sold. This was the food of feasts, the prized ingredient of medieval banquets. Still, wheat wasn't something peasants grew in abundance. It was too delicate to endure the brutal winters, so it was mostly reserved for special occasions. The peasants, especially in regions with colder climates, often substituted it with heartier grains like barley or oats. But wheat still had its role, especially in areas with favorable conditions where it could grow and provide that coveted loaf of bread. What's truly fascinating is the debate among historians about how much of medieval Europe relied on wheat. Was it the staple crop for most of Europe, or did its role as a luxury crop hold it in the hands of the elite? Wheat's complex history reflects the delicate balance between survival and luxury, between necessity and indulgence. As the cold evening wraps itself around you, you can almost taste that rich, soft loaf of bread, baked to perfection, as it makes its way to the tables of both peasants and kings alike. You pull your cloak tighter around you as you journey through the fading light, and soon you arrive at a familiar sight: peas and lentils, the forgotten yet vital legumes of the medieval world. While grains like wheat and barley dominated the landscape, peas and lentils were quietly holding their own in the background, sustaining families in ways you might not have expected. In fact, they were the workhorses of the medieval diet, especially during times of scarcity. Peas, in particular, were a lifesaver during the harshest of winters. These little legumes could be dried, stored, and eaten long after the harvest season had passed. When bread was scarce and meat even scarcer, peas and lentils offered the perfect protein substitute. They were hearty, filling, and, most importantly, affordable. The peasants would often cook them into stews or soups, mixing them with whatever vegetables, herbs, or salted meats they had on hand, creating a warm, comforting dish that could feed an entire family. Interestingly, peas were so crucial to survival that medieval farmers found clever ways to make the most of them. They didn't just serve as food, they also acted as a form of soil enrichment. Peas were legumes, which meant they fixed nitrogen in the soil, making it richer for future crops. This symbiotic relationship between peas and the land ensured that these little legumes were indispensable both on the table and in the fields. Historians still debate how widespread the cultivation of peas and lentils was across medieval Europe. Were they as common in the northern regions as in the southern parts, where the growing season was longer? And just how often were lentils consumed compared to peas? Some argue that lentils were more of a luxury, reserved for the wealthier classes, while others suggest that peas were the staple across all levels of medieval society. Either way, peas and lentils were the unsung heroes of the medieval pantry, quietly sustaining generations with their nutritional punch. Now, as you imagine, a hearty bowl of lentil stew warming your hands by the fire, you understand why these legumes played such a pivotal role in medieval survival. As the winds howl through the trees, you turn your attention to the next crucial crop that helped medieval peasants survive the cold: fava beans. These hearty legumes, often overlooked in favor of their more popular cousins, peas and lentils, were a reliable staple in the medieval diet, particularly in regions where the land was tough and the winters were long. The fava bean, with its sturdy nature, was one of the few crops that could endure through harsh conditions, and it became a lifeline for peasants during difficult times. The fava bean's resilience in the face of the medieval winter is one of its most remarkable qualities. It could be sown early in the spring and harvested in late summer, and in many regions, it was one of the few crops that survived through the cold months. As a nitrogen-fixing plant, fava beans also enriched the soil, making them a great companion to other crops like wheat and barley. This made them not just a food source, but a crucial part of the medieval agricultural system, helping to sustain the soil for future harvests. In medieval kitchens, fava beans were often turned into stews, soups, or even ground into flour to make simple, filling breads. They were particularly valued for their high protein content, which made them an essential food for peasants who didn't have access to much meat. Fava beans were also used as animal feed, providing another level of utility on the medieval farm. For both humans and animals, they were a versatile, sustainable crop that helped keep the community fed during times of scarcity. Historians still debate whether fava beans were widely grown throughout Europe, or whether they were more common in the Mediterranean regions where the climate was more favorable. The debate also lingers around whether they were a significant part of the diet for all classes, or if they were mostly relegated to the poorer peasant households. But what is undeniable is that fava beans played a vital role in sustaining medieval populations during difficult winters. So, as you imagine a warm bowl of fava bean soup simmering on the hearth, you realize that this humble legume was more than just food. It was a tool for survival, one that kept peasants going when the cold seemed unrelenting. As the night grows colder, you move through the frost-covered fields, drawn to the resilient crop that continued to thrive during the harshest of winters, the humble turnip. In the medieval world, turnips were a life-saving crop. They were easy to grow, hearty, and could endure both frost and neglect, making them a staple of the peasant diet. The turnip wasn't just food, it was survival in a root vegetable form. Unlike the delicate crops like wheat or barley, turnips didn't require special care. In fact, they thrived in the cold, their roots burrowing deep into the frozen earth. Just when other crops were failing, turnips could be stored for months after harvest, their hardiness allowing them to be available long after the growing season had ended. During the winter, turnips became an essential source of nourishment when fresh fruits and vegetables were scarce. Whether boiled, roasted, or made into soups, turnips could be found in nearly every medieval peasant meal. Interestingly, turnips were often paired with other preserved foods, such as salted meats or dried legumes, to stretch what little was available. They were also a favorite in the homes of poorer peasants who could not afford the luxury of more refined grains or meats. But even wealthier families occasionally turned to turnips when fresh foods were hard to come by. What's fascinating is how turnips also played a role in medieval agriculture. They were often grown as a secondary crop in between the main harvests, providing a reliable source of food when the primary crops were unavailable. In some cases, turnips were even used as feed for livestock, making them a multi-purpose crop that kept both people and animals alive. Historians still argue whether turnips were truly as widespread as other crops, or if they were more of a last resort in times of famine. Regardless of their status, turnips were undoubtedly a food that kept medieval society running through the coldest months. A crop that required little care but offered much in return. As you imagine yourself preparing a pot of turnip stew, the smell of earthy vegetables rising from the fire, you understand why this crop was one of the quiet heroes of medieval survival. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential, and it played a big part in ensuring that peasants could face another winter. The wind picks up, and you find shelter in the shadow of a nearby barn, where cabbage and kale are growing strong even in the midst of winter. These frost-resistant vegetables, the cold-weather powerhouses of the medieval garden, were crucial for survival when other crops had long since withered. Their hardiness in freezing temperatures meant they were often the last green vegetables available to peasants before the first signs of spring. Cabbage and kale, simple yet essential, became the unsung heroes of the medieval winter diet. Imagine a peasant woman stepping out into the bitter cold, her breath visible in the frosty air as she carefully plucks cabbage leaves from their sturdy stems. These leafy greens, able to withstand the sharpest of frosts, were more than just food. They were a source of crucial nutrients during the long months when fresh produce was a rare commodity. Whether eaten raw in a hearty salad, boiled in soups, or preserved in brine for later use, cabbage and kale provided both sustenance and variety to the otherwise monotonous winter meals. What makes cabbage and kale particularly fascinating is their ability to thrive even when other crops failed. Their ability to endure in freezing temperatures was a vital resource for medieval peasants. In fact, kale was so prized that it often became a key part of medieval feasts, especially during winter holidays when fresh greens were needed to balance out heavier meats and breads. As historians debate whether cabbage was used in the same way across all regions, there's no doubt that these frost-hardy vegetables were among the most reliable food sources available during the cold months, and it wasn't just their cold tolerance that made cabbage and kale valuable, it was their ability to be stored for extended periods. Peasants would often harvest cabbage late in the season and store it in cold cellars or bury it in the earth to preserve it through the winter. This meant that cabbage could provide a continuous source of nourishment, even when the winter months dragged on and other food supplies dwindled. As you picture yourself in the midst of a cabbage patch, the cold air biting at your cheeks, but the green leaves still standing strong against the frost, you understand why these vegetables were such a vital part of medieval life. They were more than just food. They were a testament to the ingenuity and perseverance of peasants who made do with what nature offered, even in the harshest of seasons. The winter air has turned colder as you wander through the frozen landscape, but something catches your eye. A small patch of green, perhaps buried beneath the snow, or peeking out from a frozen patch of earth. It's a crop that may surprise you. Ancient vegetable, one that kept medieval farmers alive through the worst winters. These resilient roots were turnips' companions in the fields, and today they are often forgotten. The potato's predecessor, the humble root vegetable known as the swede or rutabaga. Now, you might be wondering why we've skipped past potatoes and gone straight to swedes. That's because the potato, as we know it, didn't make its grand entrance into European diets until the late 16th century, when it was brought back from the Americas. Before the potato, peasants in the colder regions of Europe grew rutabagas as the root vegetable of choice. Swedes were hardy, cold-resistant, and capable of thriving in the harshest conditions. While they weren't as glamorous as some other crops, they had an impressive role to play in surviving the medieval winters. Swedes were incredibly versatile. Their thick, tough skins were perfect for long-term storage, and they could last through the cold months, buried in the earth or stored in root cellars. When food was scarce, these root vegetables became a staple, boiled in hearty stews or roasted in the fire. Though they might not have had the mass appeal of more well-known crops like turnips or cabbages, Swedes filled an important niche in the medieval peasant's diet. Interestingly, Swedes were also grown as animal feed, providing much-needed sustenance for the livestock that were essential to farm life. They were particularly favored in Scandinavian and Northern European regions, where the long winters demanded crops that could endure the harsh elements. The debate still rages among food historians. Were Swedes more commonly cultivated than we think, or were their crop relegated to the colder, more rural parts of medieval Europe? Either way, this humble root vegetable is a forgotten hero in the story of medieval survival. Imagine a medieval farmer bending down to harvest Swedes from the frozen soil, their breath steaming in the cold air, grateful for the crop that would keep their family fed during the harshest of months. Swedes were the unsung champions of medieval diets, quietly nourishing those who needed it most during the darkest of winters. As the cold winds continue to sweep across the landscape, you pause for a moment and reflect on the surviving crops that have sustained medieval societies through centuries of hardship. Among these humble foods, there is one that holds a special place in both medieval kitchens and modern agriculture: the ancient grains that have slowly made a comeback in recent years. These crops, once essential to medieval diets, are re-emerging in today's food systems, and their resilience and nutritional benefits have renewed interest worldwide. Take a moment to imagine yourself standing in a medieval field, not of wheat or barley, but of spelt, an ancient grain that was widely cultivated in the Dark Ages. Spelt, a relative of wheat, was hardy, capable of thriving in poorer soils and colder climates. It was often grown alongside other crops, providing both food and animal feed. Spelt was an essential part of the medieval diet, appearing in breads, porridges, and even in early forms of pasta. Historians continue to debate the exact role spelt played in medieval diets. Was it more common in rural communities where the soil was less fertile, or was it a staple in urban centers as well? Despite these debates, what is undeniable is that spelt provided a versatile and nutritious alternative to wheat. It was particularly favored for its high protein content, making it a key source of energy during times of scarcity. In fact, some scholars argue that spelt might have been even more nutritious than wheat, offering a richer combination of vitamins and minerals. Today, spelt is experiencing a renaissance in the world of agriculture, as farmers seek more sustainable and resilient crops in response to climate change. Ancient grains like spelt, barley, and rye are being reintroduced into modern farming practices, prized not only for their resilience but for their nutritional value. These grains are naturally higher in fiber and protein than their modern counterparts, offering a healthier alternative to the heavily processed foods that dominate our diets today. Imagine walking through a field of spelt in the present day, the grains swaying gently in the breeze, a reminder of the medieval crops that have made their mark on history. Spelt, once a survival crop in the medieval world, is now a symbol of both ancient agricultural knowledge and modern sustainability. As you think back on the incredible journey these ancient crops have taken, from the Dark Ages to the present day, you realize that they're not just relics of the past, they're part of a growing movement toward more sustainable, resilient food systems. The resilience of these crops in medieval times has laid the foundation for a more sustainable future, proving that even the most humble foods can survive the test of time.